Hey everybody, my name is Kevin and welcome to my little YouTube channel. You might see that the majority of mine are little travel videos, maybe a little flying, and some Kerbal Space Program videos, but I hope to do more of what this next video is, which is a lecture that I do every year or a couple times a year for my high school class about socialism. I know that's a big scary word, but I am a long time believer in the ideas of Marx and Marxism and all that good stuff. And I hope that this is the first introduction in a way that it's an introduction to a high school class. I try to be easy and understandable. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. And if you like it, let me know. If you don't, let me know, and we'll go from there. But without further ado, here's the lecture on Intro to Socialism.
Here is a little more background of Kevin. This is one of the best classes I have ever had, KG.
All right. We'll see.
Oh, once again, we're just going to give a normal welcome. Just one clap, please. 1, 2, 3. Kevin's in the house. Let's go.
All right. How many people are on the other side, like the side of the room that the laptop or whatever isn't facing? Is there a lot of people on?
Well, this is a smaller class of 26.
Okay. All right. That's fine. So, okay. Well, I don't know how much of an introduction Walters gave about me. I guess you got the little sheet in front of you, or you had, but real sort of quick. My name's Kevin. And I went to OHS in 2000. I graduated in 2004. I went to undergrad at MSU in Mankato. I studied political science and philosophy. I got a BS in political science and philosophy, which you guys can laugh at that. That's funny, right? Bullshit. All right. Well, loosen up a little bit. So, and then I, I graduated from college when the economy tanked in 2008. So it was very, very difficult to find a job. So I went back to college, got a master's of public administration, which is basically like a business degree, but for the government. Excuse me. So I moved to Florida, couldn't find a job, ended up getting a job as a paralegal for a law firm that was helping people going through foreclosure during the foreclosure crisis. So, when you buy a house, you get a loan from the bank. So the bank basically owns your house because if you don't pay your mortgage, the bank forecloses on the mortgage and takes your house away. So I was helping people who were being treated unfairly by the big banks who got billions of our dollars. So that's kind of how I got into the law stuff. I ended up working in a factory a little bit when I came back to Minnesota and worked at some law firms, realized that I wasn't going to be anything but a paralegal if I didn't go to law school. So I went to law school. I'm here in D.C. I just finished law school like this semester. So just a few weeks ago, I submitted my last final. So right now I'm studying for the bar exam I'll take in D.C. and I'm working at a local law firm here. So if you guys do have any questions about law stuff, I guess I can answer that too. Um, but brief background as to how I'm here to talk about sort of introduction to Marxism and socialism and stuff. So I kind of think it's important to tell you how sort of I got here. So I was 16 at OHS, and I was in our English class. We had to do like an Oxford-style debate, and Walters will tell you that I was a very perhaps overconfident young man, and so I wanted to, yeah, sure. And I thought that I could probably beat anybody with the power of my words. So I thought that I would take on something that I knew I would lose. Excuse me. So I thought, well, I learned in my history classes that Nazism, communism, socialism, terrorism, anarchism, it's all the same, right? It's all anti-American, anti-capitalist, bad, lots of death kind of stuff. So let's argue for something like that. And I thought arguing for Hitler is a little distasteful, so let's argue for communism. So then I had to actually read things like the Communist Manifesto and actually read about the ideas behind communism. And what I realized, and what I will tell you is, everything that you've learned about it is likely wrong. There's a lot of reasons why. There's a big campaign that's waged in the school of propaganda against this idea because it challenges the status quo that we sort of live under. And so there's a big disinformation campaign about what these ideas really represent. And so I actually realized that that was the case. I gave the I did the debate, and it's Oxford style. So at the beginning, everyone votes who's in favor, who's against. So everyone was against, the United States adopting a communist form of government. I think was the motion. And then did the debate, and I actually sort of believed that it was actually a good thing. We actually should do that. And so I ended up convincing the entire class. So everyone opposed at the beginning, everyone in favor at the end. So I thought, oh, there's something to this. So then I was in Walter's economics class, and I was very annoyed that he didn't talk about socialism because it was all just capitalism, stock market, money, all this kind of nonsense. And so I thought we should talk about socialism. So he told me that I should give the lecture. I gave the lecture to my own class when I was a senior in high school. And then he asked me to come back and do another one, and 13 years later, here I am. So, yeah, I've been involved in this for a while. I've been involved in a lot of different socialist organizations, communist organizations, and, have tried to help people who are the victims of this economic system. And so, I guess, at minimum, hopefully, I don't seem like some crazy weirdo who's got some far-out ideas that aren't reasonable or anything like that. So hopefully I get a little bit of credit. I don't know. We'll see. You guys let me know if that convinces you or not. But just before I start, I guess, what do you guys think about when you hear the word socialism? If somebody tells you, "Hey, I'm a socialist," what do you think about that person? What does it make you think about? Anybody? I want it to be interactive. So if you have a question, just ask it. I don't care. Interrupt me. I'm not some lecturer. So you go right ahead. And if I can't hear you, we'll have to have somebody pair it.
What, when someone says, "Hey, I'm a socialist," what do you think? Ashley.
I don't know.
Tina.
Do you trust that person? Do you think that person is a good person, is a bad person, is somebody to be afraid of, somebody to be... What do you think?
Good.
Do you want to know more about what they think, or but okay, let's do this. Raise your hand if you think that if somebody says I'm a socialist, they're a good person.
A few guys.
All right, how many of you would be worried about that person, would think that that person is dangerous? Well, my job's done. You guys are like ready to join the revolution. It's great. So how many people, I imagine you guys have learned about the Soviet Union and about the gulags and the massive oppression in the Soviet Union and in China, the oppression that happens there, and a lot of those kind of experiences, which are pretty terrible experiences. You guys, raise your hand if you've heard of those stories about those experiences. Okay, right on. So, I guess I want to start out by saying that a lot of those things are not recognizable in the Marxist tradition as something that you could call socialist. It's really, people have this idea of socialism is where the government runs everything. There's no freedom. The government decides what you do, when you do it, how you do it, and that everyone's paid equally, except for there's a group of people who are extremely wealthy and get more perks than everybody else. Does that sound familiar to everybody? Corrupt societies where there's bread lines and all that kind of stuff, right? All right. Well, that's not what it is. That's what Stalin said that socialism was. And Stalin was wrong. And we've all been parroting what Joseph Stalin has told us what socialism is. And Joseph Stalin was not a socialist, at least in terms of what system he presided over. He was an authoritarian thug. And I think that that's an important thing to say right away, that I am in no way advocating for what happened in the Soviet Union, what happened in the Soviet Union and in China and in Cuba and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is North Korea, can be understood through a certain framework of understanding the world, and that framework is Marxism. I think an important thing to understand is that the ideas of Marx and Marxism are not dogma. It's not the Bible. It's not Marx said we have to do X, therefore we have to do X. You might think that, given what a lot of people who are in favor of Stalinism would think. But really, it's a framework to understand what's going on in the world, and how you can understand the importance of history in terms of understanding the present. So, I don't know if you guys have the little outline in front of you, but I wanted to sort of start out by just introducing a basic idea, which is that Marxism is a scientific framework for understanding, history. Okay? Meaning, it's a way to see how history's developed so that we can understand what's going on. And because one important thing that Marx said was that all the philosophers before him and before that time had sought to interpret the world. But the point is to change it. So your interpretation is all well and good, but if it doesn't give you the framework to make the world better, then it's not really that valuable. And so Marx is important that he's not just giving a framework to understand, he's also giving a framework to critique and to go beyond, which is very important. It's not just a critical thing. It's not just complaining. It's also trying to understand what we can do about the things that we see that are wrong. So what's really important about what Marx said is that we have to understand that what's really important are the material conditions of people's lives. What they think is important and will be determined in a lot of ways by what their society is like. So really what you have to do if you want to understand how history's developed and how people have come to where we are today, you have to understand what their societies were like on the ground. Who produced what? Who owned what? Who was able to distribute goods and services? Because that's what really determines the majority of people's lives. It isn't whether you think that this is true or that is true or believe in a God or don't or anything like that. None of that is really all that important in understanding how history has developed. So when you look at history, you can look at it through through a different framework, an idealistic framework, which is where Marx sort of gets his basic ideas from a philosopher called Hegel. Hegel came up with this idea of dialectical idealism. And dialectical idealism is that ideas, major ideas like freedom and religion, community, rights, all of these ideas guide history, and they come out because of competitions between different ideas. And that competition is done in a dialectical form. That just means there's a thing, then there's its opposite, its antithesis, so a thesis and an antithesis. And they will, because they're opposites, inevitably collide with one another, and some of the contradictions in each will fall away, and it will produce a new synthesis. That's the sort of way to think about it. The easiest way that I know to explain it is evolution. So evolution by natural selection is about the genetic, the sort of way we pass down genes being sort of encountering changes in the environment that then that cause a response that creates a genetic mutation that then responds to the change, and it continues on in that dialectical way. There's a thing, there's its reaction, it produces a new thing which has its own reaction, and so forth. So Marx took that idea and said, yeah, that dialectical method makes sense. That is how things sort of work. There's a give and take on everything. When you make someone mad, they tend to make someone else mad, or they come back at you in the same way. There's a lot of those kind of interactions that are how things actually sort of work. But what Hegel said is that they do that in the form of ideas, in sort of people's minds. So there are times in history when a new idea comes out, like constitutional democracy, where all of a sudden it changes everything because it counteracts with the old ideas and sort of supersedes them. And Marx said, no, that's not it. What it is it's the material conditions of people's lives. It's not idealism, it's materialism. So it's dialectical materialism. So what that sort of means is that when you look through history, what you find is that there are different periods of history in terms of human organization based on different modes of production. So in, the sort of 250,000 to, say, 12,000 years ago, we were basically small groups of hunter-gatherers in Africa. mostly in Africa. We kind of spread out a little bit, but small groups, and what Marx called, and there's a little different terms in anthropology now, but basically a sort of communal or primitive communist kind of organization where you hunted, you gathered, and then in order to keep everybody alive, you had to give food. Otherwise, you couldn't hoard food, you couldn't sell it. It wasn't really money or anything like that. You got the stuff and you distributed it in a way that was helpful, at least to the continuation of the little group. But then we developed agriculture around 12,000 years ago, and we developed different forms of production. And so you had sort of slave-based productions, where one group would enslave the other, own the sort of land and tie them to the land, which then developed into a feudal arrangement where you had knights and kings and lords who oversaw serfs and peasants who were tied to land, who would do the production but didn't own anything. And then that developed into a capitalist system where instead of having feudal lords and serfs, you had employers and employees, where one group owns and controls and the other one essentially, instead of being like a slave to somebody or somebody who is continuously indebted to somebody, you then rent out yourself to another person. So they develop in these different sort of periods of time. And what you really have to understand, and why the beginning of the Communist Manifesto says the history, all of the hitherto history of the world is the history of class struggle. Because what you have to understand is that the mode of production always produces classes of society. So a lot of us here today, when we think about class, we have no idea what we're talking about. Like if I asked you, how many of you guys are working class people? Raise your hand if you're working class.
Who's all working class?
Who's middle class? All right, and who's rich?
Smith won $50,000.
Yeah, so I'm guessing everyone is not middle class, not rich, or not poor. How many of you guys think that you're sort of in the middle? You're not rich, you're not poor. Okay, that's the idea. The idea is that there's this great middle class of people who aren't poor and aren't rich. But the thing is, a class is not how much money you make. It's not how comfortable you are in society. What a class is what is your relationship to how things are done? So here's a better question. How many of you own your own business? Raise your hand if you own your own business. All right. How many of you guys have a job? Raise your hand if you have a job. You guys work at your job, right? You don't own your business. So you're working class. Because your relationship to production is that you work at it. You don't own it. So I know that in America, no one wants to think that they're poor, and working class has this connotation of being poor. But LeBron James is a working class guy. He's got a lot of money, but he's not in the owning class. He doesn't own his team. He just works for them, and he gets paid a lot. But the owner gets paid a lot more. So it's important to understand what class really is. What class really is who's got what relationship to production. So in slave societies, you have slaves who are the workers, and you've got nobles who don't work, and they own, and they use that position to enslave other people. Same thing in the South when we had slavery here, and now we have a situation where you have an owner's class who employs people, and that is the system that leads them. That's the class distinction in society.
So the question is, I guess for you guys, is if we think about socialism as a contradiction, as the sort of antithesis to capitalism, what do you guys think capitalism is, and what do you think is, if there is anything, that's wrong with it? Can you guys give me some, what do you think of when you think, if somebody says, what is the capitalist system? How would you answer? Crickets. Come on.
Who said that? Say it louder.
You have to work for the money that you get.
Okay, you have to work. Yeah, so that you get paid a wage. All right, so it's wage labor. So, I mean, capitalism really means private ownership of the means of production. Now, what does that mean? The means of production are everything it takes to make stuff or to do a service. So it's the building that the business is in. It's the people who, or it's the machines that make the stuff, or it's the computer that you use to do your job. That's the means of production. And in capitalism, those are owned by individuals. Usually. they're owned by people who do so not because they work there, by and large, but because they have money to be able to purchase it. They have capital. Now, capital is the business, tons of money, anything that you can use to make or own a productive enterprise. That's why it's called capitalism. It's about using and making more capital. So, anybody think that there are any problems with capitalism? Anybody see any issues with the way the economics works in our country and around the world? Everybody's great. Everybody loves it. No problems.
Christian, go. Tell them what you don't like about capitalists, or your job, or.
Just the amount of people that are rich compared to the poor. How a small population of the country has so much of our wealth.
Right, right. One of the major issues that's pretty evident in capitalism is that it's a very unequal system. That in that sense, it's not fair. That there are a lot of people who have nothing, and there are very few amount of people who have a lot. Let me tell you a statistic that might blow your mind. Something like 80 people, 80 individuals, so about 3 or 4 of your classroom size, have more wealth than the bottom half of the world's population. So 5 billion people have 80 people, 80 individuals have less than 5 billion people in terms of wealth. That's how bad the system is in terms of the inequality. You guys, it's been almost 10 years, so I guess you guys were pretty young, but 2008 was a big economic crisis in the country, the second biggest that the country's ever gone through. Millions of people, I saw them every day, lost their home, were kicked out of their houses, lost their job, lost their pension, lost their retirement, were made poor overnight through no fault of their own. They had done everything that they had been told to do. That's also something that happens in capitalism about every 15 years. There's a major, major crisis. Now, you guys might have learned it in school as the quote-unquote business cycle. So there's a boom, and then there's a bust, and a boom, and a bust. That's not a stable economic system. If your roommate, or let's say your parents, were as emotionally unstable as capitalism is, you'd want to move out. Because a system that goes through huge booms and huge busts is not a sustainable system. And every time there's a bust, people die. The death toll from the 2008 economic crisis can't be totally known, but anytime there is an economic crisis, suicide rates go up, poverty rates go up, food insecurity goes up. You have people who are dying on the streets literally in the richest country in the world because of this massive inequality. So where does that come from? Most times what you'll learn, especially in your economics classes, is that what's the motivation for doing business in capital?
Why does anyone go into business? Is it because they want to provide a valuable service to people? No. It's because they want to make money. They want to make a profit. They want to make lots of money. They want to become Bill Gates or Warren Buffett. But how do they do that? How does somebody create profit? They sell something for a higher price than it costs to produce. Well, what's part of the cost to produce something? It's the building that you produce it in. It's the machine that you use to produce it. It's the labor that it takes to actually produce the thing. And the raw material to be able to actually do it. Building, machine, labor, raw material. That'll get you an end product that you can then make a profit from. But who creates the value that you assign then to the commodity that you produce when you put it on the market? Who makes the commodity? Is it the person who owns the business? No, it's the worker. It's the person who got paid to do the business. So if they're selling the commodity for a higher price than they paid the person who actually created the value, what are they doing? Stealing from them. The owners of business in a capitalist society exploit their laborers. What does it mean to exploit? It's a charged word, I know. But most times, what exploitation merely means is to take advantage of something who has an inability to stop you, basically.
is to use something else for your own benefit based on the fact that they really can't stop you. So we exploit the resources of the earth because it can't stop us from putting a dynamite stick in the ground or cutting down the tree. And we also, in capitalism, exploit human beings because what we do is make human beings a commodity too, where they have to sell themselves for a certain price, what we call a wage, and that price is less than the amount of value that they create when they're doing their work. So that surplus value then is taken by the boss merely by the fact that they own it. By them saying, I own this, therefore I'm going to take money from your pocket because I can. Now there's lots of arguments about the investment that it takes to create businesses and the amount of work that goes into it, and shouldn't people be paid because they do that work? Of course. Everyone should be paid fairly for the work that they produce. The thing is that in this system, what you have is a return on investment. I'm sure you've heard that term, ROI. So that doesn't mean that I invest something and I expect to be paid for my work and repaid for my investment. It means that once I'm repaid for my investment, I should no longer have to work and I should still reap the rewards. Why? Because I own it. I started it and I own it. I don't have to work here. I owned it. I started it. It's mine. And that gives me the right to exploit you. And if you don't like it, find another job. Problem is, every single job is like this. There's no way that any working person can escape that system of exploitation. The system itself is based on it. And the problem with that is that what you're doing is not paying people enough to buy the products. Because you see, you're selling the product at a higher price than you're paying the people to produce it. So what happens? Eventually, people aren't going to buy everything that you produce. And so, as the Communist Manifesto says, capitalism is amazing because it is in a system that deals with scarcity. That's not the issue in capitalism. People don't die of hunger because there's not enough food. We're post-scarcity on food. It's because it's not profitable to feed everyone in the world. So, but what happens is that we have so much productive capacity that we produce so much, and we don't have enough people to buy it. And so there's a crisis. Oh, I have too much stuff. I need to make a profit. I'm going to dump it and sell it for cheap. That's going to make a crisis in the system. And our system is so interconnected that as soon as one domino falls, there goes the rest. And that's what you had in 2008. We sold too many mortgages than people could pay for because people are poor. Here's the thing that should make you very angry. You guys will be paid less than people who are working at easier jobs in 1970. That the real wage for people is lower today than it was in 1970. The United States of America used to be the place where the working class was growing and was able to, you could send your kid to college on one income, and one family member could stay at home and take care of kids. Can't do that anymore. Why? Because we haven't had a raise in 40 years. While the profits of the profits have never been higher in real dollars. So wages haven't grown in 40 years and profits have never been higher. That's because we are being massively exploited. If you ever want to know how much we're being exploited, they track it. The Department of Labor tracks it. It's called productivity. The economic indicator called productivity is how much work we do for how little we're paid. So you want to look at that rate? It's outrageous. And it's been growing. It's been nothing but growing for the past 40 years. So our exploitation rates have not been this high at least since 1970, and we're approaching a time when it hasn't been even close to that since the time when Marx was writing. So this is a very serious time when you guys are going to be dealing with two major problems. You're not going to be paid enough to make buy the products that you need to live. You're going to have massive debt when you come out of college, which is going to make you have to find the first job that you can find, and you're going to have a system where there's going to be a major crisis or two that are going to seriously destroy your job prospects, and you're going to have to compete with robots, which you're all never going to be able to do. So take this warning that I'm giving you, that you guys are going to have to do something to change this system. Otherwise, it's going to take advantage of you, where you are going to be poorer than your parents. And that's against the American dream. So capitalism is, and I will say this, against what the American dream is all about, doing better than we did before. Because capitalism can't survive like this. It's showing itself to be a very destructive system. And here's the thing to give you an idea. in the United States of America, in the law, you might want to write this down. You have a fiduciary duty to other people. Now, a fiduciary duty means that you have the responsibility to some other person to make them as much money as you possibly can. And you have a legal obligation. You can be sued for not making people as much money as you could have. So let's put this in real concrete terms. Let's say there's a board of directors who runs a chemical factory on a river. And they say, well, look, we can pollute the river, or we can put them in oil drums and send them off to somewhere. Polluting the river is a lot less expensive, so we're going to have a higher profit. And they say, you know what, it's not the right idea to pollute the river, so we're going to do the more expensive option. A shareholder of that company gets pissed. Says, I just lost money because you didn't increase the profits. You have a fiduciary duty to make me as much money as I can. I'm going to sue you. And they get sued, and they lose a lot of their money. So the next time that decision comes around, what do? They say, I'm just going to pollute the river because I don't want to get sued. And what you have is the creation of what they call externalities, things outside of my business that I can't control, like global climate change. I'm not solely responsible for that, even though I'm the board of directors of ExxonMobil. I'm not responsible for that. I have to look at my shareholders and how much money they're going to make, and I have to make them the most money. So if that means drilling down in the Deepwater Horizon and causing a massive oil spill, fine. That's what it takes. That's the kind of system that we live in. Those are the kind of decisions that we make. And we have a government not of, by, and for the people. Let me tell you that. We have a government of, by, and for the rich. Because we have a single-party state in this country. A one-party state. The Republicans and Democrats are two factions of the capitalist party. The closest thing you have to anything contesting it is Bernie Sanders. And I hope you all saw what happened to Bernie Sanders. Which that he was the subject of a number of smear campaigns and a significant, I would say, racketeering-esque conspiracy to ensure that he was not given a fair presentation to the American people. So there's some problems. And these problems are not new. They've been going on for a long time. Marx talked about these issues in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And there's been some changes. Our systems have gone through some massive instances. But the results of capitalism are pretty clear. Massive inequality, massive poverty, massive death, and war. Remember, World War II comes at the heels of the worst economic crisis capitalism has ever gone through. So this is a system that cannot long survive, will not long survive, and is in the process potentially destroying the ability for us to even have what Noam Chomsky would say, organized life on this planet. So it's a serious challenge, and it's not something that we should take lightly. So, what's the solution? The solution is socialism. Now, socialism is not what happened in the Soviet Union. Well, let me stop before I go down there. Does anybody have any questions? I've been talking for a while. Questions?
Kevin, how many? And again, let's just do a little time frame, like Friends of Yours, Moatana, 2004 to 2006, 7. How many of those friends do you think had to go back home and live with mom and dad after the crisis of 28? Roughly.
Every single one of my friends from high school and a majority of my friends from college who didn't have a long-term partner had to move back home, at least for some time. It's hard maybe for you guys to understand, but like we were told that you go to high school, you graduate high school, you go to college, it won't be too expensive, you'll get out, you'll get a job. So we all did that. And when we got out of college, we didn't have a job. We didn't get a job. And what jobs we got them at Starbucks and Jimmy John's and Taco John's and places like that. Places that were well below the education that we had gotten. And there's a lot of people that are thinking right now, and many of my friends said, this isn't worth it. I'm going to go incredible amounts into debt. I mean, I am hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt because I went to law school. So, this is it's a serious economic problem that in other industrialized countries like Germany, it's free to go to college. You don't pay for it. And we're the richest country in the world. So why can't we pay for it? It's because we have a government that's not run in the interest of normal people. It's a government run in the interest of the rich, and we could easily half our say military spending, and that would be able to pay for people to go to school. But we in the United States have a government that chooses to spend more money on bombs than it does on books, and that's partly because of the entanglement of very powerful economic companies who have a tie into the defense department of our country, who are able to make a lot of money because the things that they make blow up. So you have to make more of them. Like making a bomb is the best thing that a person can make because the bomb blows up and you need another bomb. So it's not there's a lot of reasons why our government is the way that it is, but underlying the whole thing is our economic structure. And so that needs to change. Any other questions? Okay, so what happened in Russia? Right, that's a terrible story. Karl Marx said that basically, if you understand how history develops, all of the new systems, so like any of the progressive systems that are the sort of new development in history, come from the most advanced versions of the ones that existed before. So capitalism develops where feudalism had really fully developed. So in Britain, in Germany, in France, this is where the Industrial Revolution comes out and the capitalism that comes with it. And so if you, what he said was, socialism is going to have to take that same course. It's going to have to exist where capitalism really shows all of its contradictions, goes into these crises, and develops a strong working class of people that know how to run those big industries and know how to do them so that they could be done instead for profit. They could be done for the general welfare of people, to be able to ensure that everybody has everything they need. So if you looked at the time he was writing, Russia was the Somalia of the world in some ways, with an authoritarian regime. It was very backwards, very undeveloped. They didn't have an industrial working class. Most of the people were peasants living on farms, working on these big land holdings where they would produce agricultural crops. So he said the last place that socialism is ever going to be successful is Russia. But history being what it was for a lot of different reasons, it's the place where it happened. And I think you have to understand that what they tried to do was jump over an entire period of history where things develop in a sort of capitalist mode of production, where you have things like a republic. So we don't have a democracy in America, but we do elect people that represent us. So there's some ability to control your government. That never happened in Russia. They went right from an authoritarian czar to a very authoritarian state. They were also, this is important to remember, after 1917, they were invaded by 10 different countries, including our own. Let me say that again. In 1917, after the October Revolution, the United States joined along with a number of other nations, including the United Kingdom, to invade Russia to help people against the revolution conquer it. So the Russia never invaded the United States, but we invaded them when they had their revolution. So take that into account. And they engaged in a 4-year-long civil war, which decimated the country. This was on the heels of losing millions of people in World War I. So they come out of that, an agrarian society that's been destroyed by war. And despite their not being able to do it, they have this theory that they will be able to develop industry and create their working class. So they develop what becomes essentially state capitalism. And that's now actually the system that exists everywhere in the world. You'll hear a lot of people call it crony capitalism. You guys ever heard that term? I don't have a problem with capitalism. I just don't like crony capitalism. What they mean by crony capitalism is state capitalism, where the state either owns or has a significant involvement in the economy. So what they did is they developed a very successful but very destructive and deadly state capitalist system, so that they developed incredible industrial capacity. Remember, the Soviet Union was the backwater of the world when the revolution happened, and within 40 years had put a satellite into orbit and a human being into orbit. That's an incredible accomplishment, but it cost a serious price. And that serious price came in human lives and the destruction of war and famine. So I'm not in any way defending what happened there, but it was not the place in which it would have been successful to happen. The same is with China when they had it in the 40s. Another agrarian society that didn't have an industrial working class, who developed that industrial working class through the state, but who did so at massive costs. But they are not a communist country. The Soviet Union was not a communist country. They are state capitalist countries. Because what is socialism? Socialism is working people's control over the means of production. It's communal control over the means of production. So whereas you have individuals owning it, in capitalism, in communism or socialism, you have the people who work at those enterprises owning it. The abolition of what Marx called private property. Now, private property isn't your pencil, your shirt, your car, not even your house. It's factories and stuff like that. No individual ownership of those. It should be owned and controlled by the people who work there. That's all that it means. So what that means is that socialism is democracy, which means that socialism is not anti-American. It's very American. It's as American as apple pie. Because when you live in the world today, you expect to live in a democracy, except when you go to work. Then you live in an authoritarian dictatorship, just like they did in the Soviet Union. You don't get to decide what you do, when you do it, how you do it, and what's done with the profits. Somebody else does. And they do so simply because they claim ownership of it. So socialism is really just working people's control of the means of production. So, is that what existed in the Soviet Union? Absolutely not. Is that what exists in China or North Korea or Cuba? No. Cuba, in some ways, there's some, but not much. So, but really, there are examples of this existing in the world today. Worker-owned businesses. So, Hy-Vee in town is an employee-owned business. Now, it's not employee-controlled. The employees don't get to decide when they work, how they work, what to do with the profits or anything like that. But if you're a full-time employee, you can get some of the benefits if Hy-Vee does well. That's pretty good, but it's still a dictatorship. It's not quite perfect. But there are companies, Mondragon is a company in Spain, fifth biggest, something like that, fourth or fifth biggest corporation in Spain, and it's an employee-owned and employee-run business. So there's a if you guys want to read about something very interesting, Marina Lleida is in Spain. It's a little town in Spain where it's a communist town. Communist enclave. Everybody works, low rent, very little money exchange. It's a little communist utopia in the middle of Andalusia in Spain. So there are examples of this being possible, and it's the issue is that every time it's been attempted, it's encountered violent opposition. Just like if you look at the history of the labor history of this country, what you realize is that the history is incredibly violent. We haven't any time that the workers have attempted to take back what they feel is taken from them by their owners, the National Guard comes in, or the police come in and break them up, and have, in many times, killed or murdered them. So here's a little tangent, but we celebrate Labor Day in September, right? Nobody else in the world does. Labor Day is May Day. It's on May 1st. So we in DC had a big march on May Day to celebrate International Workers' Day. Why do we celebrate it on May 1st? Because in Chicago, in the 1880s, 1886 I believe it was, they were striking for the 8-hour day. Remember, before then, you worked 12, 13, 14, 16-hour days. It was when workers got together and said, we're not going to work this long. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours to do what you want. That was out of a workers' struggle, and starting in the United States. And when they had a strike, when the bosses wouldn't agree to the 8-hour day, they went on strike. And on May Day, in the Haymarket area of Chicago, during the rally, a bomb went off. And in the course of that, they arrested a few anarchists and socialists and hung them. And so they became the Haymarket Martyrs. And that was on May 1st in 1886 or 7. And so around the world, we celebrate the power of the international working class on May 1st, except in the United States. And why is that? Because not only do we have a history of repression of labor movements in this country, but we have a history of repression against people like me. I want you to understand that people like me have, in this country, been jailed, deported, murdered, and repressed by the United States government. You can just look up the Red Scare, the Mitchell raids, the like Sacco and Vanzetti. I don't know if you heard about them. And then the McCarthyism. And also, I'll give you an example. Fred Hampton was a member of the Black Panthers in Chicago and was murdered in his bed by the FBI.
How about Eugene Debs, too?
Eugene Debs was also was a three-time presidential candidate, and the time in, I think it was 1916, I think it was the election, maybe 1916, he was in jail having spoken out against the war. During World War I, if you spoke out against the war, you were jailed because there was no free speech during that time. And so Eugene Debs had spoke out against the war, ran as a socialist and got over 1 million votes, but was in jail. Actually, prisoners wept when he left jail because he was so popular there. So this country has a long history of labor movements. In Minneapolis in 1935 was one of the most important strikes that the country's ever endured, and I bet you never heard of it. Because they don't teach you this kind of stuff. Because if they taught you the impressive and interesting history of this country, you might actually want to get involved. And that's scary. Because there's a lot to lose by a few number of people. And they'll use any means they have. Write down this. COINTELPRO. Counterintelligence Program. I'm sure you've never heard of it. This was a 40-year campaign by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to repress and destroy left and radical groups, including the FBI, the Black Panthers, the Communist Party, the Socialist Party. And it's partly the reason why you haven't heard about a lot of this, because they have been erased from American history, even though the fact that you only work 8 hours a day is because of them. The fact that you have a weekend, that you don't work during the weekend, is because of this movement, and Americans doing this. And it's been erased from history, because that doesn't serve the interests of the people who run the show. So when it comes to the experiences before, when someone tells you that communism kills, no, capitalism kills. Whether that be the state capitalism of the Soviet Union killing millions of people, or the millions of people, tens of millions of people who die every year in this world because of malnutrition, curable diseases, and conflicts that are because of the extractive resources that are making so much money. Oil, diamonds, and things like that. These are causing the deaths of millions of people every year. It's a deadly system. It's an immoral system. And it does so while still robbing you of the money that you work hard to earn by somebody whose entire job is to walk to the mailbox every 3 months and get their dividend check. So what I'm trying to say is that this is a serious issue. And this is something not to just take lightly. If you care about issues of, say, racism or sexism or homophobia or any of those ideas, understand that those are all going to be exacerbated by capitalism. Why? Because that's a way of tearing a working class apart. Because if the working class is united, it's easy to take out. There's way more of us than there are of them. But if they're divided by race or class or gender, that's a great way to keep them divided. It's also a way to specifically pit people against each other so that you can exploit one over the other and therefore bring down everyone's wage. So why haven't we gotten a wage rage in 40 years? Because jobs have moved over to places where labor is cheaper, where people are willing to work for less. So they make us compete against each other, and they also make us hate each other, which is where you have issues of, say, anti-immigrant anger. It's because there's a real economic reason for it, but they're scapegoating. They need to be focused
on the people who are really stealing from them, which are the rich. So if you want to fight racism, sexism, homophobia, or any other of those kinds of things, what you really need to recognize is their material relationship to the economics that are going on, how they interact with those, and if you really want to fight them, join up with the socialists. So I guess with that, I'm willing and able and hopefully, going to answer some of your questions. So if you guys have any questions or comments, or if something I said pissed you off, please let me know.
I'm going to pick on a couple people first. I got two Hy-Vee boys back here. Can you explain to the class what that employee owned, and some of your working conditions, and explain that, what Kevin was talking about with Hy-Vee? Dylan wants to talk. Go.
I don't know. There's really no difference. I don't feel like there really.
Yeah, I think that if there's no difference, it's because you don't control the business. So while you might get some of the benefits if they do well, how they're doing it, who's doing what, how they're doing what to do with the profits, isn't really up to the workers. And that's why it's important to recognize that socialism, this idea of socialism, is not just getting the money in a capitalist enterprise. It's changing the relationship that we have to our jobs, because we don't want our jobs to be authoritarian. We're Democrats, small d Democrats, not Democratic Party, those guys are a joke. But small d Democrats, we believe that democracy should be, you guys as students should run your school. The student council at the school should not be a bullshit organization, which it is. It's a joke. I was in the student council in 2004. You know that little sign you walk under when you go to the football games? Isn't that nice? We didn't do shit. What we could have done is we could have done amazing things about changing some of the curriculum or doing more student engagement with society instead of making a stupid, having some useless dances where people, you know, just heighten their sexual tension. We don't need any of that. What we need is real democracy at our workplaces, in our communities, and in our schools. And the things that we do are things that we should control. And the fact that we don't is antithetical to what I thought I was raised with, which is freedom, democracy, liberty, you know, brotherhood. Let's get together and do stuff. Let's not compete with one another and divide each other up. So I can understand why the thing at Hy-Vee is not that much different than any other enterprise, because you don't get to control anything. But imagine if you guys had a council, which is, clue you into something. You know, a Soviet Union? The word Soviet means council. It's workers' council. What they really meant was a sort of council union. And what they did was they had Soviets, workers and soldiers Soviets, who would bring different workers from different factories together and help them coordinate with each other so they could more efficiently do their kind of production. Imagine if you had that at Hy-Vee and you were able to say, you know what, we're gonna make everyone's gonna get paid the same, but we're gonna work 35 hours a week, so more people can work, but you know, we don't have to work so much for so little. You would probably do that. I'll answer your question in 1 second. Imagine if this difference. We're the board of directors, and a company we can move to China, where they're gonna make $1 a day, and these Americans where the company is, they want to make like $25 an hour. We're going to move to China because we're going to make a hell of a lot more money. If you're the board of directors and you have that fiduciary duty, what are you going to do? You're going to move that factory. You don't care about the workers. You don't have to. You got to make the company money. But let's say the owners worked at that factory, and they said, guys in China could do this, and the profit of the company would be outrageous. And they'd all go, yeah, but we'd all lose our frickin' jobs. So they'd never move. So all of this movement of jobs overseas and things like that, if workers controlled it, they wouldn't do that. That wouldn't have happened. So it's important to understand that it's just not getting the benefits of the business through some kind of, you know, Chobani style employee stock option program, but it's about being able to control what's going on in your life. And so again, I just bring it back to democracy. I mean, socialism is democracy. And pound that into your head. If you hear anybody talking about authoritarian socialism, you know that person doesn't know what they're talking about. So all right, what's your question?
How would you implement socialism?
So there's a big debate about that within the sort of community. There's a question of reform or revolution. So can you do maybe what Bernie Sanders is talking about and sort of institute reforms that would eventually be able to legislate socialism? And there was a big party, Germany, they're still around, the SPD, the Socialist Party of Germany. And they were the biggest for a while, and they almost had a revolution in 1919. Another thing that we don't learn, that, you know, if it would have happened in Germany, it would have spread around the world, and you guys would not. We would be living in a very different world if that had been successful. And it was drowned in blood by what eventually would become Hitler's army. So if you guys want to learn about something very interesting to know more about German history, look up the German Revolution of 1919. What you'll find there is that one of the leaders of it was a amazing woman named Rosa Luxemburg. And she wrote a whole pamphlet about this idea of reform or revolution. And she had it exactly right. What she said is, reforms are good. You know, we want to increase people's conditions at the time. But if you reform things, if you only do it through the kind of legislature or Congress or something like that, there's two problems. One, you're not addressing the fundamental problem of capitalism, the fundamental exploitation and the accumulation of the capital that comes from it and the power that you're able to get because of your accumulated capital. So it doesn't address any of those. It's just trying to piecemeal deal with some of the issues. So Marx and Rosa Luxemburg were revolutionary, in the sense that what you really do need is a revolution against these systems. Because what Marx saw was that anytime you had a change from, say, ancient communism to slave, from slave to feudal or feudal to capitalist, they came with revolutions. So the American Revolution is what Marx would call a bourgeois revolution. Bourgeois meaning like owner class is the bourgeoisie. It's a French word. But the America, our revolution was a bourgeois revolution against feudalism, the king, and for capitalism, sort of running things on your own. And the French Revolution was another bourgeois revolution. The Egyptian Revolution in 2011 was in many ways a bourgeois revolution, because there sometimes has to just be a break with the old order. They will try anything to stay in power for as long as they possibly can, and eventually you just need a break. And it's been the unfortunate thing in history where revolutions are usually very violent. I will say that some of the least violent revolutions have been socialist revolutions. Usually the violence that comes out of socialist revolutions are afterwards. So if you think about the dialectic, you have the revolution, then you have its antithesis, the counter-revolution. And they come together in a big conflagration, usually a war. So in Cuba, they walked peacefully into Havana when they won their revolution. There was not a shot fired. In October, technically November, but in the October Revolution in Russia, they didn't fire a shot. So these are but there was a war afterwards that cost a lot of people's lives because of a counter-revolutionary force. Same with Egypt. Not violent in terms of the revolutionary, but there's a counter-revolution that becomes very violent. So if you're worried about the violence in the idea of a revolutionary movement, understand that we want a revolution in the sense that merely changing the class structure of our society, to get rid of that class antagonism. Because Marx's the history of, all history is the history of class struggle. We want to end that, because class struggle is very destructive. It's very not helpful for us, and it's helped us create things like capitalism, which has industry and automation, all that kind of stuff, but it ultimately kills a lot of people and could potentially destroy the ability for human life on the planet. So we need a serious kind of break with it. And so my idea would be, you have a party who has the designation that they want to take over the instruments of the state, because the state is what enforces your property right. If you want to sue somebody for going onto your land, you go to the court. And if you really want them to get off your land, you call the cops, because the state has the monopoly of violence. That violence is usually used to protect property. Remember, the cops, it doesn't say to serve and protect people, remember. It just says to serve and protect. And the police are there to serve and protect property and people, and usually in that order. So the state is there to protect people's property interests. So what you do is you have to take over the state, either by an election or by some kind of revolutionary coup type of thing. And what you would do then is institute a legal structure that would then, what we would call, expropriate the ownership status of the businesses. We will say you are no longer allowed to singly own a business. If you work at that business is a cooperative enterprise that you then, by virtue of being able to work there, also own it. I think that if you would do that, you'd change a lot of the way that people relate to a lot of different things, and you'd do a lot of changes that would be much deeper than merely getting rid of ownership rights, like changing people's relationship to money, where you'd be using money less as a means to exchange things. Normally, because I have the idea of adopting a universal basic income as part of this too, so that as a way to make sure that everybody has everything they need, you give everybody $2,000 a month. And then they can work beyond that and gain beyond that and get rewarded for their work, but that at least everybody has a house and some food and the ability to decide for themselves what kind of house they want to live in and what kind of food. So they're not in a welfare system, they're in an egalitarian system where you're given $2,000, that's the minimum, everybody get that, and then for it.
So I think that those are the kind of ideas that would be instituted in a socialist, because socialism is a transitionary period between capitalism, private ownership of the means of production, or state ownership of the means of production, and a sort of the beginnings of a worker-owned means of production. And then that transitions into a communist state where you now have perfect, sort of a complete worker control of the means of production, and you have
the disintegration of different divisions, like state. There's no real reason to have boundaries between states because it's not necessary. Money becomes less important because what is the use of money when we're freely exchanging our labor to get everything that we need in a way that our economy is designed to fulfill needs, not just give people to be selfish and pursue their profits. And so what you're doing is creating a system that isn't based on greed and selfishness, which is what ours is, which makes us believe that our human nature is somehow greedy and selfish, but it creates a society where it's weird to be greedy and selfish, that you're sort of like, why are you such an asshole? Like, why don't you just be nice and just work hard, and you're given everything that you need, and you're given status when you do something great, so just be happy with what you have, which is much different than the situation right now, which is struggle, die, find whatever you can. If you can't, you're going to go on welfare, or you're going to go on the street, and if you can't cut it, you die. And so I think that's so I think you need a revolutionary change, but I think that the revolutionary change has to be guided by a set of principles that respects the human being, respects our human rights, and does so in a way that promotes them and doesn't discourage them. And I think that a 21st century revolution against what a lot of people are calling late stage capitalism would have to be one that is as peaceful as possible and as harmless as possible. The problem is that the people who own things have shown themselves to be those who are going to protect their interests at all costs, including murder. And so that's an important thing to remember, but socialists are very rarely on the offensive against things. They're usually defensive. And so if our revolution does not encounter serious violence, no serious violence will result. Because people want freedom.
Real quick here, KG, the Scandinavian countries, how close are they to what you're talking about here as far as giving $2,000 a month working? I mean, are they getting close or not close?
I think the Scandinavian models represent the highest stage of welfare statism. So a welfare state is a state that says that that here is the bar, and under this bar no one will fall, and that is a good thing. I mean, it's helpful in order to make sure that there is not. I mean, you all just need to come to Washington D.C. to realize that you're in the capital of the richest country in the world, and there are poor people everywhere. The city is segregated and divided in a way that it's very obvious who's rich and who's poor, and it's usually because of the color of their skin. So there's a lot of problems with our quote-unquote welfare state, and theirs does a lot better. They have less people, but they also have less money. But the problem with those is that they don't fix the fundamental contradiction. This is what it's what Rosa Luxemburg said about reforms, that you can institute things that are good for people, and we should support them. I mean, it's good for people. But you're not fixing the fundamental contradiction of capitalism, so even if you have a good welfare state, it goes into crisis. There's a time when you're going to have something overproduced, and you're going to have a crisis in the economy, and it's going to reverberate and destroy in a lot of ways the ability for your welfare state to continue to operate. So Scandinavia is a good place. People are happy there. But they'd be a lot happier if they'd have some control over their workplaces. And if you look at IKEA, or you look at Nokia, these are not good places to work. People are not happy in Finland when they're at work. They're happy when they're hanging out, drinking, or enjoying the snow, or whatever they do in Finland. So I think, so it's one of those things where, like the Hy-Vee situation, there are things that we can do that make our lives a little bit better, but until we address the fundamental problems of our society, nothing's ever going to change. So I implore you to really think about and try to get involved in and it doesn't have to be with socialists and communists. I mean, we would love that. There is a summer camp for Socialist Alternative that's going to be at Pillsbury in next weekend. My wife will be there, and I'll be in town a little bit. There's ways to connect yourself if you're at all interested, and even if you don't do it necessarily with an anti-capitalist organization, remember the connection that capitalism has to all this. If you get rid of capitalism, you're not necessarily going to get rid of racism, but you're well on your way, because racism is a capitalist invention. Let me say that again and try to burn it into your brains. Racism is not inherent to human beings. Tribalism is, for sure, but not racism. Not divisions between races. That's something that was very beneficial for the development of capitalism, and it's been very helpful in the maintenance of capitalism. So if you want to fight racism, you have to fight capitalism, because those two things are intertwined. Sexism is exactly the same too. In many ways, women were more respected than men in a lot of different periods of modes of production, but not in capitalism. Not at all. The role of women in capitalist society was for a long time to reproduce the working class that would then be exploited, and now they're asked to do that as well as be part of the exploited working class. So you can see how these things intertwine with one another, and being able to connect those dots is very important in terms of your further development and your ability to unlearn what you have learned in the words of Yoda, because it's important to be able to do that. You have to be able to see things for what they really are and not for what people want you to see. And so there's a lot of propaganda around, and a lot of, I don't want to say fake news because that's too much like Trump, but if you guys are seeing what's happening with Trump, there's likely going to be an impeachment of the President of the United States. This is the time to be aware of what's going on in politics, but to remember that there are a lot of other things going on, like the loss of your ability to have a free and fair internet. That's all being happened while this impeachment's going on. There are thousands of people dying every day in Yemen with U.S. bombs, with bombs that say made in the U.S. on them. There is massive oppression in many places in the world. And so while you should, I hope, be galvanized politically by this current time in our nation's turbulent and very sad history, don't forget the long picture, the other people in the world, and the root cause of all of this, which is our economy. Our economy is unfair, it's unfree, and it's anti-American. And so I think, we owe it to ourselves as Americans to be against this system and to be in favor of a system that really abides by the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, where people are really free and equal and endowed with rights that include not just life, liberty, and happiness. Remember, they had life, liberty, and property is what it's supposed to be. But Thomas Jefferson was smart and didn't do property. He said happiness, because I think he recognized that sometimes property gets in the way of happiness. So this is a very American ideal, and I want you to try to take from this at least the idea that socialists are not scary people. By and large, they're some of the nicest people I've ever met. They don't want to kill you. They don't want to hurt you. They just want you to be free, and they want you to be fairly paid. Because in this system, those who are paid a lot don't usually deserve it, and those who are paid a little usually do all the work. And I think that if you guys think about that for any more than 30 seconds, it should make you irate, because it's unfair, and it goes against our basic human decencies. It's a dehumanizing system, and we shouldn't allow it to continue. It's a very long-winded answer to the question. What's another question? Anybody? What time are we done? 3:30?
7 minutes.
How many minutes?
About 7 minutes.
Oh, all right. Well, come on, I got another question. Anybody ready to join the revolution, or anybody seriously doubt what I'm saying is the truth? I mean, I'm down for anything.
Speaking of Jefferson, do you think he had some free socialist ideas? Because in his Declaration of Independence, he talked about we need to pledge our lives and our fortunes to get this government started.
I think that if Thomas Jefferson had been Thomas Jefferson 100 years after he lived, he would have been on the barricades fighting for the revolutionary socialist cause. He's a product of his time, and that's another thing that Marxism is helpful with. I mean, you got to remember you have to understand people in their time, and I think that Thomas Jefferson thought that we shouldn't be an industrial society. So in that sense, he's not very socialist. He thought we should be agrarian, and so, but the ideals that he expressed are ideals that when manifested in their true form in an industrial society he lost the debate with Hamilton about what kind of society the United States would be. It's an industrial society. And if you take the ideals of Thomas Jefferson and plug them into an industrial society, what you should have is a socialist paradise. But the thing is, the Senate of the United States of America, of Congress, the Senate is there to protect the rich. Madison said that. The House of Representatives represents the rabble masses, all of us that our founding fathers didn't. Remember, our founding fathers were elitist, not Democrats, did not believe in democracy, believed in republic, good governance, elite control. And that's the system we have today. So it's got elements of democracy. There's a House of Representatives, but that house is not the upper house. It's the smaller one. The lower house is the House of Representatives, the one that represents the rabble, and the privileged elite one is the one that represents the owners. So even in our own country, our country was revolutionary at its time. It's amazing that we had a religious division. It took us a little while to get something like the 14th Amendment so that the laws were actually applied equally. But we do have it. It's important to note, and I imagine you guys don't know this, but we're the only country in the world that our Constitution is the oldest Constitution in the world. It's the only one that hasn't been updated or revised or completely readjusted. And it came out of an attempt. They can see you, Elka. But you guys totally missed it because you weren't paying attention. But yeah, my wife tried to like crawl along the way. Okay. So there are ideas that are important in Thomas Jefferson and some of the founding fathers, but they are at a certain time in history, and that time in history was not one that was popular in socialist minds. Those ideas were around, but it had to go through a phase of industrial development, and we're past that phase now. And we're at the point where, I mean, robots are going to take your guys' jobs, honestly. So you got to recognize what we're going to do about that, because in the words of Rosa Luxemburg, let me put it this way, it's either socialism or barbarism. And what I mean by that is either we have to adjust it so that we can use the machines to really benefit everybody, or we're going to be at each other's throats, and we're going to be in constant war. Because we're going to be constantly poor. Well, it's like, I don't know if you guys saw that movie Elysium, where all the rich people live on this thing that orbits the Earth, and all the poor people have to stay down on Earth. That's the society that we're going to. The Hunger Games, stuff like that. If we don't make significant changes, those are not going to be dystopian futures. They'll be our reality. And so it's important to recognize that and to know what to do to fight it, which is to understand that capitalism is the root cause and to figure out the ways to fight it. And there's lots of ways to fight it. I won't tell you how, but getting involved in a socialist organization in Minneapolis, the Industrial Workers of the World, their idea being we just need one big union, not a bunch of different unions that negotiate contracts, but one union where if somebody gets mistreated at work, everybody goes on strike, so that until that person gets their job back. That's the kind of idea Industrial Workers of the World. They have a huge branch up in Minneapolis. If you're all interested in getting involved with them, call up the IWW. They'll love to have you guys. And it's up to you guys. You guys are much younger than me, and it's up to you guys. I mean, I know the recent polls suggest that people your age are at least not opposed to socialism, and sometimes they like it more than capitalism. So I think if we make sure that we understand what those words really mean and use them correctly, you guys all have the advantage because very few people know what these words mean when they're used, and most people use them incorrectly. So now when you hear somebody say that socialism is Stalinism, you'll know that person is, well, I'll say, like, I'll use one of my favorite quotes from Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens. You should check that guy out if you like it too. But if you gave a lot of people an enema, they would fit into a matchbook. It means they're full of shit. A lot of people don't know what they're talking about, and if they tell you that socialism means authoritarianism or dictatorship, they're full of it, and you can tell them because now you know more about what it is. So yeah, that's.
I'll let you go, man.
All right.
One day, go ahead. One more hand. 1, 2, 3. I'll be contacting you later, brother.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, and like I said, if anybody has any questions or wants to get more involved or anything like that, you want to talk to me more or yell at me or anything like that, feel free. Walters has my information. I obviously can do Skype and stuff. So, don't be a stranger.
Love you, brother.
Au revoir.
Take care, buddy.
All right.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.